accepting minimum compliance is not the answer, but we've also got to look at whether the rules we put in place are actually going to ensure that there is sufficient investment in the human capital in the airline, if you like, which makes it work as far as that safety outcome. And I'm not talking just about people who say safety is our highest priority, but I mean I'm talking about people who believe and walk the walk as well as talk the talk about safety is our first priority. I think that we've introduced safety management systems, SMSs you see everywhere. The bottom line of them is they require risk-based management training for all the people involved, from the bottom to the top, and how many organisations actually invest in that. So somewhere along the line, I think part of your solution is to look at how you ensure the minimum investment in those sorts of qualities in an organisation. Because I don't believe you can afford to allow airlines just to come and go like car dealerships, for instance, because I think obviously the public fallout is huge, and there is an element in Australia with the distances involved in travel that we can't afford to do that sort of thing. That's probably going to mean greater financial scrutiny, and obviously that's a problem for government in terms of how much you interfere and how much you don't. But in the end, it comes to those investments.
Captain McKerris didn't really answer your question, and I don't want to either, really, but I can't look into the minds of senior management or boards of airlines, but in reality, I suspect, and I only suspect, that there is a view around the world in some parties that, oh yes, we could afford to wear a hull loss because we've got good insurance cover and it's cheaper to not spend that extra bit of money. Safety is a very, very expensive item, and then the world has got us down to an incredibly low accident rate. We're actually the safest mode of transport on the planet. But to get that last 2% of safety is going to cost us the same amount as it did to get the 98. And in reality, we're starting to see that slightly trend up, as I said earlier, about hull losses. So, no airline wants to lose an aeroplane, and so I wouldn't think that...
And I'm not suggesting they're about to, but I mean the difficulty for us is that it's been put to us that it's better for us to have a Senate inquiry than to have to sit around and watch a Royal Commission into a hole in the ground.
I don't want to testify at a Royal Commission, Senator, but Captain McKerris raised something quite interesting. The ICAO technique these days is when they issue a standard, they write a safety management system requirement and all the standards, and in fact one of the things that we're talking about now, the fatigue aspects, is about to be issued. The final draft of that standard has been reviewed by the Air Navigation Commission and it will be issued on the 23rd of November, don't hold me to that, this year, and that will become a standard and a recommended practice, and which means Australia will have to show compliance. And that'll be a step forward. Yeah. The other thing that they're doing is they're collating all these safety management system requirements into what's called Annex 19. There are currently 18 annexes in the Chicago Convention. They're going to have Annex 19, which is the collated view of the safety management system of how ICAO sees how you should have it. You'll have a safety management manual to go with that, and it would be in the best interests of our country, and I'm sure the regulatory authority will do this after the government empowers it, to adopt those principles in that safety management system, because that will at least drive some of these people to look seriously at what they're doing. But I agree with Captain McKerris's earlier comments that you can pay lip service to these glossy terms like SMS and just culture and all those things. Unless you actually do it, you don't achieve anything. It's like the dreaded ISO 9000. All ISO 9000 proved is you had a bunch of documents that said you were doing something. It didn't actually prove you're actually doing it.
The difficulty is, I mean, if you put too much emphasis on the testing, you disregard the training.
Absolutely.
You can pass the test. And I mean, I don't like the comparison with train drivers, by the way. I can declare an interest. We used to have 1,200 railway employees. We've now got a prison to take its place, and we've got about 20 railway employees. But if you go to sleep on the job in a train, I mean, I can remember it took 20 years, I think, to argue that you shouldn't have firemen in the front of an engine when it didn't have a fire. It was diesel, but it took 20 years to get the firemen out. But at least if you go to sleep on the job there, the train actually stops on you and you don't crash.
Well, one of the things the industry is designing for, because of pressure from the airlines, is they're designing for what's called the single pilot cruise cockpit. What that means is you need two pilots to fly the operation normally, but because of pressure on costs, they're saying, oh, well, we only need one pilot sitting in the flight deck when the aeroplane's in the cruise. Now, it wouldn't take a genius 10 seconds to figure out there's issues like going to the restroom, getting food delivered and falling asleep, you name it. But they're going down that route because the industry's pushing them to save money.
Oh, my God. you.
I just have a couple more questions. To Captain Mackerras, are you saying that we need to have stricter regulations because mere compliance is not enough, and you may want to take that on notice and give AIPA to give suggestions of where you think regulations ought to be strengthened?
Could I just comment that given the fact that CASA, with all its resources, still hasn't produced the goods since 1996, then me...
So that's about flight training?
In lots of areas, in these sorts of areas, it's a very, very broad subject.
Okay.
I was sitting on the Part 91 and 121 regulatory form process, and I agree with Stephen Phillips that we did it and it didn't get issued. Now, Part 91 is general operating flight rules, Part 121 is air transport operations. We slaved for weeks here in Canberra to write those regulations. They never saw the light of day. Now, they're doing it now, but that's years later.
Because I've got limited time, really if you could take some of that on notice. I just wanted to ask you about another incident. This relates to the Jetstar aircraft departing Darwin at the end of October last year with a severe weather encounter, and make it very clear that there's no suggestion that the crew were at fault. In fact, the opposite, that they behaved impeccably, and I think that's the information that you've been provided as well. But there was a concern that could have resulted in a hull loss. The ATSB has indicated in questions I noticed that they're aware of the event, but they have decided not to investigate it further at this stage, as I understand it. What is your understanding of that event? Presumably they were AIPA members, those pilots and that crew.
Yes, they were, Senator, and I've got a minute that the captain wrote to me, or wrote to us, and outlined what had happened, and he's quite concerned. In his view, that they thought they were going to die because of the severe weather event that the aircraft encountered. It actually basically stopped climbing for a while there, quite some period of time. The reason it appears to be a downburst from a thunderstorm, in other words, a severe wind shift after takeoff. Now, they did their best to see if the weather was around, but they couldn't see it because it was right overhead the airfield. And
they couldn't have seen it?
No, they couldn't have seen it. So there are some systemic issues there that probably need looking at. One is that the air traffic controls in the tower, who are Air Force controllers, did they have access to weather radar picture overhead the airfield? I suspect they didn't. Thunderstorms in the Northern Territory have very high bases. They have a 7,000-foot base, not a really low base like you see down this part of the world. So they have winds and rain and things that don't necessarily hit the ground until it's really in the wet season. You commonly can see a lot of clear air under the thunderstorm, but they still have all the effects of thunderstorms have. So the situation seems a bit strange. You wouldn't investigate an accident where there was a near hull loss. That is quite alarming to me.
So it's your view that it was a near hull loss?
Well, that's what the captain and the crew of the aeroplane reported to me. They thought they were going to die, is the words they used.
So that might raise issues of air traffic control and other systemic issues.
Yeah, it's a chance for the system to look at itself and see what we could have done better. Do we have a weather radar picture that we could have advised the crew of? We've had an event in Sydney where a 747 had a major wind shear event some time ago. The captain of the aeroplane's a friend of mine. The wind was showing southerly at one end of the runway and northerly at the other. Now, the air traffic controllers were never required to give the different winds. They only told him the landing wind, but if they told him the wind was 180 degrees out and much stronger at the other end of the runway, he would have known that there was a change of wind coming as a result of thunderstorm activity. And he said to me, I wouldn't have landed, but he got caught in a wind shear event, and he was lucky to say...
He would not have landed, did you say?
He would not have landed. He would have waited for the weather to clear. Now, since then, the process in Sydney is for the air traffickers to tell you the wind at either end of the runway if they think there's a differential. But we're relying on the air traffickers to give us that advice. We can't tell when we're on approach.
I think in the Darwin situation that the crew spent a lot of time making the appropriate assessments. They were on the end of the runway for 10 minutes or so trying to assess the weather, and they were seeking advice from all the normal agencies from whom they could get advice. So in this case, air traffic control could give them no more information than they already had.
The crew took a very conservative and proper approach in that.
Absolutely.
I must say that I was trying to take off in Singapore some time ago in a different model aeroplane than I currently fly, and there was huge thunderstorms crossing the northern end of the runway, and every other airline that I can't mention just disappeared into the thunderstorm, and I said to the tower, I'm not taking off. And they said, oh, you've got to clear the runway. So I cleared the runway, and then they made me taxi to the other runway, which was a 25-minute taxi. So we're now late. When we lined up, there's thunderstorms there, so I again refused to take off, and I waited till the gap between the thunderstorms. Qantas was the only airline that refused to take off. Everyone else was blasting off into the sunstorm. Now, they didn't crash, but it must have been a fairly wild ride after takeoff, and I wasn't willing to wear that.
Thank you.
Senator O'Brien.
Thanks. So is your organisation satisfied with the regulatory environment in Australia generally? I know you make recommendations about what CASA should do. How would you categorise your view of our regulatory arrangements?
Senator, I said that the compliance and regulatory system was adequate, and that would be a fair assessment. It could be better. The regulatory reform process has been tortured, to say the least, over the last 10 years or more. That was a mental shift in the regulator between whether we show compliance with Europe or get in line with Europe or get in line with the American way of doing business, and the industry was just looking for guidance. The industry will comply, but as we've clearly stated, some parts of the industry will go with minimum compliance, so others will exceed those levels. So my view is there's a lot more to be done. Simple things, as I said earlier, like definitions of duty times and things need to be clarified, because we see airlines taking advantage when other ones showing compliance. So I know the CEO of CASA very well. He's probably sitting behind me, and I know he's a man of integrity and he will work towards that. And I know the people are well-intentioned in there, but they need to get this stuff out.
So has it improved since Mr Byron's time?
It has. At least there's been some decision-making, yes, whereas it was just bogged down before.
I think he's smiling.
Really?
Never mind that sideshow. Interestingly, your comments about wanting to follow a European versus a US model is probably directed at Mr Byron's approach, which was to seemingly devolve responsibility for regulation back onto operators. Is that how you saw it?
Well, that's like giving kids the keys to the candy shop, in my view. And I must say, on the European model front, European had the JAA, the Aviation Authority there, represented a fair chunk of countries in the European Union. But when they moved to the EASA, the Aviation Safety Agency, they instantaneously threw out all the Part 2 stuff and tried to rewrite what's called Part 1 regs, and they bogged themselves down. They worked in a 2-year program to get the vital stuff out, and they're still bogged down. They're years and years behind. And now people in Europe are screaming blue murder for those that very issue. So I'm glad we didn't follow that route, if you get my drift.
Yeah. And while we're on the subject of regulation, the US Congress passed a bill which put severe limitations on the ability of an employee of the regulator to move to become an employee of the regulated, that is the airline. What's your view of that? I know Mr McKerris, Captain McKerris, has just talked about his own circumstance in that regard, so he might want to address that first.
Yeah, go right ahead.
I do have a view about it. The problem is Mr Borghetti, I think, also very eloquently nailed, and that was the situation is you're creating a perception of a problem. It doesn't mean that there is a problem, but a lot of what we do is actually the management of those perceptions.
One
person from Virgin said that there wasn't a problem with that. They thought it was...
No, that was the engineering manager, and again, I actually agree with his approach that there isn't necessarily a problem. It's the personal integrity of the person that's involved.
Does it matter what the relationship is? In other words, if someone's in there signing off things, ticking off the operation of a particular company, and then, moves into a senior position with that company in a short time after having had that role, is that important?
I think that's problematical. For that very reason, because there'll always be the suggestion that perhaps that when they were actually in their previous job, they had already been approached and they knew what was coming. So I think there's been some issues raised with this